At 3 a.m. on a Denver winter night, 4-year-old Toby bolts upright, wind howling outside, eyes wide mouth, unleashing a dog's bark that slices the sleeping house in two. Night after night, the nightmare repeats, and each dawn delivers a chilling crayon image, a chained, husky blood seeping into snow. No one believes him until the thaw, when his father unearths a barely breathing body behind the house. The instant Toby's hand touches that frozen fur, the dog's eyes flick open, summoning every soul nearby. It is a warning, and a promise that love can claw through ice and resurrect what was buried alive. Subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss our next mysterious and emotional storytelling movies. Inside the Bennett home, the furnace rumbled low, casting a faint warmth into the nursery, where Toby lay tucked beneath a blanket patterned with cartoon puppies. His tiny chest rose and fell with soft, peaceful rhythm. The clock on the wall, shaped like a smiling sun, ticked with exaggerated cheerfulness. 59 a.m. The second hand jerked forward. 300 a.m. Toby's eyes snapped open, not in a sleepy flutter or childlike daze. They flew wide with a suddenness that sliced the silence clean open. His pupils were dilated. His gaze darted straight to the ceiling, then to the corner of the room as if he had heard something, sensed something, and then he began to scream. It wasn't the cry of a child jolted by a nightmare. It was raw, panicked, primal. His mouth opened wide, but the sound that erupted was not entirely human. It twisted in the air, desperate, jagged, and then unmistakably became a bark. A sharp canine bark. Again and again. Rough, high-pitched, ferocious, frantic. In the next room, Rachel Bennett flung off the covers. She crashed into the doorframe in her scramble. Toby, she called, but he couldn't hear her. He was too far gone. The barking grew louder. Rachel burst into the nursery, heart jackhammering. The dim nightlight glowed lavender. She rushed to the crib. Toby was on all fours now, knees and hands planted, face wet with tears, mouth open, growling. The deep tremor of a snarl vibrated from his chest. Toby baby, Rachel knelt, arms out. "It's Mommy, sweetie. It's okay. It's just a dream." He jerked back from her eyes, wild. Then another bark. His tiny fingers curled like claws into the mattress. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth. "God," she whispered. "David." From down the hall came a thud and the sound of stumbling feet. David Bennett appeared, hair-mussed, eyes not yet fully awake. One look at his son, and his face drained of color. "What the hell is happening?" he asked. "I don't know. He just started barking. He woke up like this." David edged forward, arms out. "Toby, buddy, you're safe. Look at me, champ." Toby whimpered now, not in pain, but in confusion. In some animal sadness that didn't belong in a 4-year-old. His body slumped forward. And finally, he said words. "Two of them." "It's cold," he sobbed. Rachel and David exchanged a glance. What baby? Rachel crouched low. "What's cold?" Toby's tiny mouth trembled. "It's cold. So cold. It's cold and I can't move." David scooped him up. Toby clung to his father's chest like a drowning boy, shaking. His eyes darted to the window, the curtains swaying gently in a breeze that hadn't been there moments before. And from somewhere outside, not far off, a soft, distant bark. The pediatrician had no answers. They took him in that morning, bleary-eyed Rachel, still in yesterday's clothes. Toby wrapped in a dog-patterned blanket. The nurse glanced up when the child barked softly in the waiting room, then looked away, as if pretending not to hear. "Night terrors," the doctor said at last, tapping his pen. Children this age, particularly around 4 or 5, often experience vivid dreams as their brains mature. Add a little stress, maybe a new school or lack of sleep, and boom, nightmare city. But the barking, Rachel pressed. "He's not just yelling. He's barking like a..." Kids mimic sounds, animals, TV, video games. The brain's still mixing signals. David shifted in the chair. "He said it was cold, Doc. He said he couldn't move, that he was stuck." The doctor raised a brow. "That could be sleep paralysis. Very common. Terrifying for them, but not dangerous. I wouldn't worry too much." Rachel stared at the man. He was on all fours. "Sometimes kids act out dreams physically, especially if they're in that halfway state between REM and waking. It's called confusional arousal." They nodded, but neither of them looked convinced. The doctor smiled warmly. "Get him some rest. Fewer sweets before bed. Maybe a white noise machine. These things usually fade on their own." Toby, sitting quietly on the exam table, stared at the corner of the room and whispered, "He's still cold." Back home, Rachel tucked Toby into the couch and turned on cartoons. She set a cup of warm milk on the side table and curled up beside him, watching his eyes, watching for signs of whatever that thing was last night. David, meanwhile, had gone out to shovel the driveway. The snow had thickened overnight. It clung like icing, Rachel sighed and rubbed her face. I'm tired, Mommy, Toby said softly. I know, baby. She kissed his temple. Toby looked up at her. Can I draw something? Sure, sweetheart. She brought over his sketch pad and crayons. Toby didn't hesitate. He pulled the red crayon first, then gray, then black. His little fingers worked methodically, like he wasn't even thinking, like the image already lived inside his hands. 15 minutes passed. Rachel flipped through a magazine without reading. Done, Toby said. She looked and froze. The page showed a large, husky gray and white lying on its side in a pit of snow. A thick iron chain curled around its neck, disappearing off frame. Red marks, harsh scribbles spilled from its paws. The dog's eyes were open, wide. Rachel stared. Toby, honey? Toby didn't speak. He began drawing another one. By the third night, the pattern was undeniable. 3:00 a.m. Screams, barks, and always those words. It's cold. The next morning, David took a photo of the latest drawing and sent it to his sister, an art therapist. She texted back within minutes. That's not a dog someone imagined. That's a memory. That chain is detailed, and the proportions are too real. He showed it to Rachel. She gripped the phone. No way he just dreamed this. David nodded, then looked out the back window. Their yard stretched white and frozen under a gray sky. But there at the far corner, the snow wasn't even. It was dented, like something had settled, or shifted, or sunk. Rachel came beside him. What are you looking at? He pointed. She narrowed her eyes, then frowned. That wasn't there before, was it? David's breath fogged the window. I'm going to check it out. He grabbed a shovel. Rachel reached for his arm. David, what if this is nothing? What if it's not? She said nothing more. Toby sat on the couch behind them, drawing in silence. His new picture was nearly identical. Only this time, the dog's eye was looking directly out of the page. Out in the yard, David trudged through the snow. The shovel bit into the crusty surface with a scrape. He dug once, then again. Rachel watched from the window, arms crossed tight across her chest. Toby stood silently beside her, clutching his crayon. Crunch, crunch, shovel. David hit something, not hard like a rock, not soft like dirt. Something in between. He knelt, brushed with his gloves. Fur, gray-white. He fell backward in the snow, eyes wide. Rachel! She was already running out the door. Toby followed silently, barefoot. David dug faster now with his hands. Snow flew, and then there it was. A snout, a frozen gray snout. Lips cracked, icy, but moving. A tremble, a gasp, a breath. The dog was alive. Rachel screamed. David tore off his coat and wrapped the animal. We need a vet now! Toby stood at the edge of the hole. The dog's eyes opened. They found Toby. Locked, Toby whispered. I'm sorry it took so long. The dog made a sound, a whine low and mournful. And Toby added, he said to wait. That he'd come for you. David and Rachel turned to their son. What did you say, baby? Toby looked up. I didn't say that. He turned and walked back inside. Silence. But in the wind, somewhere beyond, a bark. Not from the dog in David's arms. Another, answering, from far away, calling. Still cold, still waiting, still dreaming. The second night it happened again. 3:00 a.m. The same scream, the same panic. This time Rachel was already awake, lying in bed with her eyes fixed on the ceiling. She didn't know why. Some instinct had kept her from sleep. When the clock turned over, she knew. The cry came sharp, louder than the night before. And again, the barking followed. Not playful, not imitated. Ferocious, desperate. Rachel ran, her heart already bracing for what she'd find. Toby was on the floor. He'd climbed out of bed and huddled in the corner. His hands clenched, his little face contorted in a snarl. Rough, rough, rough. Each bark ripped from his throat with an urgency that didn't sound like pretending. It sounded like fear, like warning. She dropped to her knees beside him. Toby, baby, stop, wake up, honey. His eyes opened. He looked right at her. Then he whispered, It's hurting. What's hurting? She asked, already crying. It hurts. The neck. The snow's too heavy. Rachel clutched him into her chest. His body was rigid at first, tensed like a trapped animal. Then it gave way and melted into her. She rocked him until the barking stopped, until the sobs came. And even then his tears felt like they belonged to something far older. The following day Toby drew again, another husky. But this time the background had changed. There were footprints, large booted ones, leading away from the dog, vanishing into the edge of the paper. The chain now had a thick shackle, and Toby had drawn red around the collar. Not crayon red, not just color. It looked like blood. Rachel stood over him, arms folded, afraid to speak. She hadn't shown him pictures of huskies. No books, no movies. And yet the anatomy and the sketch muscle lines. Ear tilt, the thick coat wasn't something a child made up. Toby set down his crayon and said, He's getting tired. Rachel knelt slowly. Who's tired, baby? Toby blinked like the question confused him. Then he said softly, The dog. Night 3. David sat up in bed, arms braced, already moving before the scream came. He stood in Toby's room doorway, shadowed by the pale hallway light. The boy sat bolt upright in bed, not crying, not barking, just staring, eyes locked on something unseen. David stepped forward. Toby. The boy's head turned slowly. There's a tree, he said. Real tall. By a wooden house. That's where it happened. David's heart pounded. What happened, champ? He waited, Toby said, and waited. But nobody came. So he laid down, and the snow covered him. His voice was flat, monotone. David crossed the room and reached out. Toby barked. Sharp. Sudden. David flinched, his hand pulling back on instinct. Then Toby's expression shifted. Confusion washed over him. His mouth trembled. It's cold, he said again. Same words, same broken voice. By morning, Rachel had made up her mind. They were going to the hospital. They needed real answers now. Toby sat between them in the back seat of the car, his little legs swinging. He held his sketch pad in his lap and drew quietly while the city passed by. David glanced at him in the rearview mirror every few seconds. Each time Toby was looking out the window, not at traffic, at trees, scanning, like he was searching for something. The hospital was white, clean, impersonal. They met with Dr. Harris, a pediatric sleep specialist. She was warm, middle-aged, efficient. She listened to everything with nods and hums. After the fifth mention of barking, she raised a brow. Children can sometimes exhibit pseudo-zoanthropy, she said. Animal behavior during sleep. It's rare but documented. Usually associated with deep sleep transitions, sometimes triggered by emotional trauma. Trauma, Rachel repeated. He's 4. He hasn't even skinned a knee yet. Dr. Harris gave a polite smile. The brain can process all kinds of stimuli, even secondhand trauma. A loud movie, a news story, something they overheard but didn't understand. David leaned forward. We monitor everything. He watches cartoons, kids YouTube. He's not being exposed to anything violent or weird. Dr. Harris turned the sketchpad. She studied the latest drawing. Now the snow had become a full scene: trees, a clearing, a small wooden cabin half buried in frost. And in the center, a large unmoving husky, shackled to a rotting post. Dr. Harris tapped her fingers. This is more sophisticated than most 4-year-olds can manage. Rachel's jaw clenched. So then what? It's not just dreams, right? I'm not saying that, the doctor said quickly. But I'd like to refer you to someone. She works in child psych, very progressive but good. Sometimes the intersection of neurology and psychology opens doors we don't expect. That's how they met Dr. Claire Levin. She wasn't what they expected. Young, maybe early 30s. Sharp features, short hair, eyes that saw too much. She wore a turtleneck and a charcoal blazer with hiking boots. Sorry, she said, shaking their hands. I just got back from a rural trauma case. I smell like pine. Rachel instantly liked her. Toby sat on the floor drawing again while the adults talked. Claire leaned forward, ignoring David and Rachel completely. Hi, Toby. He didn't look up. You like dogs? Still drawing. She smiled. Me too. I used to have a Malamute. Big fuzzy, always drooling. Toby paused, then looked up. The Malamute was scared of fire. Claire blinked. Yeah, she said slowly. He was. How did you know that? Toby returned to his drawing. He told me. Rachel's eyes widened. Claire sat back slowly, folding her hands. After the session, when Toby was in the next room coloring, she turned to them. I've worked with a lot of kids. Trauma abuse night terrors. But I've never seen this exact pattern. What do you think it is? David asked. Claire's gaze didn't waver. I don't know yet. But it's not just sleepwalking, and it's not imaginary. She opened a folder and laid out the drawings Toby had made over the past 3 nights, side by side. The continuity is consistent. The spatial awareness, the environmental detail. He's capturing the same event from different angles, like a rotating camera. David rubbed his temple. But how would he? Claire interrupted gently. Children aren't blank slates. Their minds are open in ways ours aren't. We label things as impossible because we need boundaries. But maybe, just maybe, he's perceiving something we've forgotten how to see. Rachel leaned forward, like what past lives. Claire didn't answer. Instead, she picked up one of the sketches, the one with the cabin, and traced the tree line with her finger. These are Colorado pines, she said, specifically blue spruce. And this layout, it's not just some fantasy landscape. It matches real forested regions. Rachel stared at her. Are you saying this place is real? Claire looked up. I'm saying it could be. That night, Rachel and David watched Toby sleep. No alarms, no sounds. For a while. Then at 3:00 a.m., a low, quiet bark. Not loud, almost whispered. Toby didn't wake up. But his hand resting on the sheets twitched. He murmured something. David leaned in. It sounded like he's waiting. The air was changing. Days had passed since Toby's last episode. But the silence that followed wasn't comforting. It was unnerving. As if something was biding time beneath the surface, holding its breath while the world slowly thawed. Denver's winter grip loosened. Sunshine filtered through overcast skies more frequently, and the snow, once dense and packed like old wool, began to recede. Roofs dripped. Gutters sighed. Patches of brittle grass peeked through, colorless but stubborn. The Bennett backyard, previously an untouched expanse of white, now wore a map of uneven, melt-gray puddles, mushy slush, streaks of mud. Rachel stood at the kitchen sink, mug in hand, staring out the window. It was Saturday. David was still asleep. Toby sat at the dining table behind her, doodling in near silence. Then it happened. Without a sound, Toby slid off his chair and walked toward the back door. He didn't say a word. Rachel watched him unease, flickering like static in her chest. He unlocked the door, stepped barefoot onto the icy deck. "Toby," she called, startled. No answer. He moved as if in a trance. Each step deliberate. Small footprints bloomed behind him, filling with water as they pressed into the half-melted snow. Rachel opened the door and rushed out behind him, but stopped short when he reached the far right corner of the yard. He turned. His finger extended, not trembling, not hesitant. "There," he said. His voice was firm, final. "That's where he is." Rachel blinked. "What baby?" Toby didn't repeat himself. He just stood there, pointing at a shallow dip in the snow, where the ground had slumped, almost like the weight of something had collapsed it from beneath. David's voice came from behind her, still groggy. "What's going on?" Rachel didn't take her eyes off Toby. "He says there's something under the snow." David exhaled, rubbed his eyes. "Sweetie, let's not." But Toby turned to him, expression unreadable, and repeated it with calm certainty. "He's down there, waiting." David looked past his son at the depression in the snow. It wasn't particularly deep, maybe 8 inches at most, but something about it felt unnatural, like it wasn't caused by thawing, more like it had always been there. A pocket in the earth no one noticed until the snow got thin enough to whisper. David retrieved a snow shovel from the shed. Rachel watched him approach the spot, half expecting the earth to groan or the sky to fall open. Toby didn't move. David jabbed the shovel into the snow with a wet crunch. He scooped once, twice. A thin fog of frost drifted upward with each toss. Beneath the top crust, the snow was still dense. Blue in places, frozen hard. He kept digging. After 4 minutes, the blade clanged, not against rock, but something else. Something that resisted, not because it was solid, but because it had give. David knelt, brushing snow away with his gloves. The texture was different. Not earth, not ice, something softer. He pressed his hand down. Fur, coarse, clumped, wet. He recoiled. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth. David's voice came low. "There's something here." He dug faster now. With hands with shovel, with growing panic, snow flew in flurries. The deeper he went, the colder the air became, as if a memory had been sealed there, preserving the breath of something left behind. He cleared another few inches and then stopped dead. What lay beneath the snow wasn't just fur. It was a body, a canine shape, curled in on itself, muzzle half buried, back legs twisted unnaturally, one tucked under the other, jutting out. A thick rusted chain coiled around the neck like a serpent. Its links were caked in ice, and flecks of red stained the snow beneath it. Old blood blackened with time. "Oh God," Rachel whispered. Toby stood at the edge of the pit, unmoving. He didn't seem scared, or even surprised. He just looked relieved. David leaned in closer, his breath fogging the air. Then he saw it. The dog's ribs barely moving. A rise, a fall. Subtle, barely perceptible. But there. David shouted, "It's alive!" Rachel gasped. "What are you?" "David, are you sure?" "Help me get towels, blankets, anything. We need to warm it up now." He didn't wait for her to answer. He shrugged off his coat and draped it over the dog's body, cradling its head. The husky's eyelids fluttered. Not fully open, but they twitched as if sensing light for the first time in ages. Rachel sprinted inside, reappearing moments later with towels from the linen closet. She dropped to her knees, wrapping them around the animal, trying not to sob. David looked up. "We've got to move fast. There's a 24-hour vet off Quincy. I'll drive." He scooped the dog up. It was shockingly light. Too light. Its body, limp skin and bone beneath the fur like it had been starving. And yet it breathed. Somehow it breathed. Rachel held the door open. As David ran inside, the dog bundled in his coat. Toby followed behind, calm. He glanced once more at the hole in the snow. Then he smiled. The drive to the clinic was a blur of red lights, shouted directions, slipping tires. Rachel held the husky in her lap, whispering to it, her hands trembling against its still chest. "Stay with us," she said over and over. "You're safe now. Please stay with us." The dog's eyes remained closed, but every few minutes it would release a breath. Slow, shallow, but real, alive. When they reached the emergency vet, David didn't wait for paperwork. He burst through the doors, shouting for help. The staff responded instantly. Within seconds, the dog was swept onto a gurney, rushed into a back room, surrounded by a team of technicians. David and Rachel stood in the waiting room, clutching each other. Neither spoke. Toby sat in a chair by the window legs, humming softly to himself. The same hum he always made before he fell asleep. It was a lullaby Rachel hadn't taught him, something that sounded older than both of them. An hour passed. Then a woman in scrubs appeared. The dog's critical, she said, voice even. Severe hypothermia, malnutrition, infection. We're stabilizing it, but its condition is fragile. Honestly, it's a miracle it's alive at all. David shook his head. It's been buried, days, weeks. Hard to say. The cold slowed everything. Probably saved it. But the trauma is extensive. It's going to need time, medication, and someone it trusts. She looked between them. Does it belong to you? They both turned to Toby. He was asleep now, curled on a bench, face peaceful. Rachel answered, I think it does now. That night, the snow outside the Bennett home continued to melt, trickling down gutters, seeping into soil. David went to the backyard one last time, before bed flashlight in hand. The hole remained, but something about it felt different now. Not just a place where something was found, but where something was released. He turned back toward the house and paused. Toby stood in the doorway, silhouetted by warm kitchen light. Barefoot, again. David called, What are you doing up, buddy? Toby didn't answer. Instead, he looked up at the stars and whispered, He's breathing easier now. David swallowed. He didn't ask how Toby knew, because some part of him had stopped needing answers, the kind that fit neatly in words. He walked over and picked his son up, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the cold. Not really. He only felt the warmth of something returning. Something once buried, now breathing, waiting to wake. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and wet fur. The air was too warm inside, thick with artificial heat, like a blanket pulled too tight over something already suffocating. Rachel stood with her arms wrapped around herself, watching through a smudged glass window. On the other side of it, behind the swinging stainless steel doors, a team of veterinary technicians moved quickly precisely around the table. Fluids were connected. Gauges beeped. A heating pad glowed beneath the nearly lifeless body. The husky, what was left of him, lay motionless except for the shallowest rise and fall of his ribs. His pulses barely registering, one of the techs muttered. But it's there. Damn thing's hanging on by a thread. They called in Dr. Lim, the senior emergency vet, who arrived wearing rain boots and a Colorado State hoodie. She didn't hesitate. Get a warm IV line going, she said. Let's start with subcutaneous fluids, then work our way up. We don't want to shock his system. Monitor vitals every minute. Oxygen near the nose, but low volume. Don't stress him. Inside the waiting room, David paced. Toby sat completely still. He hadn't moved since they arrived. He hadn't said a word. Only once had he broken the silence when Rachel had asked if he was okay. He'd nodded, then turned his eyes back to the door where the husky had disappeared. His tiny hands rested flat on his knees, like he was waiting for something only he could feel. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the clinic's television mounted above the front desk flickered to life with a familiar local news jingle. Rachel barely noticed until the headline dropped. Local boy discovers dog buried under snow, still alive. She turned toward the screen in shock. The footage wasn't live. It had been captured by a neighbor, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, the one who lived behind them, who must have seen the rescue. The video was grainy, but clear enough. There was David on his knees, in the snow, frantically pulling the dog out. Rachel sobbing. Toby standing at the edge of the pit, hands at his side, eyes unblinking. And then the voiceover began. In what authorities are calling a miraculous discovery, a Denver family uncovered a living husky buried under weeks of snow in their backyard. The child, just 4 years old, allegedly led his parents to the precise location where the animal was buried. The anchorwoman's voice faltered clearly, not sure what to make of the rest. Veterinarians say the dog's survival defies explanation, while the exact circumstances surrounding the burial remain unknown. The child reportedly woke up from a dream and told his parents, quote, He's there. He's waiting for me. David looked up at the screen. Jesus Christ. Rachel turned to him, eyes wide. We didn't tell anyone that. How the hell did they? But they both turned toward Toby. He was still watching. Not the TV, not the waiting room. He was watching the glass window behind which the husky clung to life. I didn't tell them, he said softly. They looked at him. I think he did. Inside the treatment room, Dr. Lim was doing what she did best. Keeping death away, 1 minute at a time. She rubbed the husky's paws between gloved hands, trying to stimulate circulation. One of the techs wrapped warm towels along the dog's torso, while another set up the space heater nearby. Temps at 86 and climbing, someone said. Still bradycardic. Dr. Lim listened for breath. The chest was fluttering now, not steady but not fading either. His vitals are holding, she said. But we're not out of the woods. She looked down at the dog's face. Icy crust lined the edges of his nose. The eyes were closed, but not slack. He wasn't letting go. Not yet, Dr. Lim whispered. You're a fighter, aren't you? Behind her, the tech asked. What do we call him? She thought a moment. Shadow, she said. The Bennetts were told they'd need to leave soon. Shadow had to be transferred to the animal recovery unit for further observation. The vet would keep them updated. But Toby refused to go. "I need to see him," he said. Dr. Lim, exhausted and dusted with ice particles, stepped out into the lobby. She saw the boy and hesitated. He looked up at her with the kind of expression no child should wear. Not fear, not desperation, just quiet knowing. She crouched. "You're the one who found him, huh?" Toby nodded. Dr. Lim searched his face. She didn't know why, but something inside her said, "Trust him. You can see him," she said. "Just for a second. But you have to be very still, very calm. He's barely hanging on." Toby didn't answer. He just stood, walked past his parents, and followed her through the swinging doors. The room was quiet. Monitors beeped softly, but the chaos from earlier had gone. Shadow lay on a metal table now, wrapped in heated blankets. His head was exposed. His breathing was shallow but audible. Toby stepped forward. One of the nurses opened her mouth to say something, but stopped. Dr. Lim watched from behind, arms folded. Toby reached out and placed one small hand on the top of Shadow's head. No hesitation, no fear, just contact, skin to fur. The dog's ear twitched. A moment passed, then another. Then Shadow made a sound, a broken whimper. Fragile, from deep inside a chest barely strong enough to rise. Dr. Lim's brow furrowed. "That's the first time he's vocalized." Toby leaned forward, whispered something no one could hear. Shadow's breathing deepened. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but perceptibly. The monitors didn't spike, but the air in the room shifted, like the static charge before a storm breaks. Toby lowered his hand. "Okay," he said. "I can go now." By the time the Bennetts got home, night had fallen. Their yard looked different, not just because of the hole in the snow. That had been filled in. David couldn't stand looking at it. No, the yard felt emptier, like something sacred had been unearthed, and the ground hadn't yet recovered. They tucked Toby in without a word. He fell asleep instantly. No barking, no cries, just silence and peace. Rachel turned to David in the hallway. He didn't even flinch. "When he saw that dog, when he touched it," David nodded. "He's not scared," he said. "He never was." Rachel leaned into him, voice shaking. "Why do I feel like he knew?" David didn't have an answer. He didn't think he wanted one. The next morning, the news story had gone viral. Every local outlet picked it up. Some national. Online forums spun theories, psychic connections, animal spirits. One blog even suggested Toby might be a reincarnated dog trainer. Rachel turned the TV off before it could warp into a circus. They weren't interested in spectacle. They were just trying to understand. That afternoon, Dr. Claire called. "I saw the news," she said. "Can I come by?" They agreed. Claire arrived 20 minutes later, snow still clinging to her boots. She held a manila folder in one hand and a book in the other. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I pulled every case I could find of child-animal trauma links," she said. "Dreams, behaviors, patterns. But none of them match this." She placed the folder on the table. "I think Toby is resonating with something, someone, and not metaphorically, physically, spiritually, whatever word you want." Rachel leaned forward. "You mean he's connected to the dog?" "I think he always was." Claire opened the book. Inside were old sketches from another child dated 1983, almost identical to Toby's. Chained dogs, trees, snow. "A boy in Oregon," Claire said. 6 years old. Same symptoms. He found a coyote buried under a collapsed woodshed. It lived. The boy called it by name before anyone told him what it was. David stared at the images. Rachel rubbed her arms. Claire closed the book. "I don't know what this is," she admitted. "But I believe your son's not imagining anything. This is real. Whatever that means." There was a knock at the door. Rachel opened it. A courier stood there, holding a clipboard. "Delivery from Mile High, Animal Recovery." Rachel signed. The man handed over a small envelope. Inside was a photograph. Shadow awake, lying in a recovery crate. Blankets tucked around him. IVs still running. But his eyes were open, wide, alert, and pinned to the photo was a note. "Responding well to treatment. Breathing normalized. Eating small portions. We'll keep you updated. Dr. Lim." At the bottom, scrawled in pen. "He perks up when we say Toby." Rachel passed the photo to her son, who had just entered the room. He looked at it, smiled, then said, "His name's not Shadow." David blinked. "No." Toby shook his head. "His name's Max." They didn't expect him to move that quickly. Not after the trauma, not after the freezing, not after being half a heartbeat away from death. And yet, as Dr. Lim opened the kennel door in the quiet recovery room, the husky, still weak, still emaciated, lifted his head. Then, with a guttural breath, he pulled himself forward. Not shakily, not uncertain, deliberately, toward the boy. Toby had been sitting cross-legged on the floor just outside the door, watching, silent. He hadn't asked to go in, hadn't demanded anything. He'd just waited. Now, as the husky dragged his frail body closer, leaving the warmth of the kennel behind, Toby didn't flinch. He opened his arms. The dog collapsed into him, and then he whimpered, not from pain, not a yelp, not even a cry. It was a sound closer to a sob. low, long drawn from the chest like something that had waited too long to be heard. Rachel covered her mouth. David stood frozen, unsure whether to move or kneel. Dr. Claire, standing just behind the glass divider, lowered her clipboard slowly. The husky nuzzled into Toby's lap, pressing its snout against the boy's small chest. Its paws curled, as if clinging. Its eyes closed. "And Toby," he whispered. "There you are," he said, gently stroking the dog's head. "I missed you too," Dr. Lim whispered. "I've never seen that before." The monitor, still tracking Shadow's vitals, hadn't spiked. His heart rate remained slow, his oxygen levels steady. But his body was no longer rigid. It had relaxed, fully. Toby leaned in, then said it. "He's not Shadow." The adults exchanged a look. Toby smiled slightly, as if hearing something the others couldn't. "His name is Max." Dr. Claire stepped forward. "Toby, how do you know that?" Toby looked up at her. There was no fear in his eyes. No confusion. "I remembered." "From when?" Toby touched his chest, then tapped the dog's forehead. From inside, Max, no longer Shadow, shifted slightly, curling tighter against the child. David finally knelt down, one hand hesitantly reaching toward the dog. "Is that okay?" he asked Toby. Toby nodded. David touched Max's fur. It was rough in places, tangled in others, but warm. Alive. Rachel sat down beside them, not trusting her legs to keep holding her up. Tears rolled freely down her cheeks. It was impossible, all of it, and yet it was happening. Right here, right now. The dog that should not have survived was not just alive, he had chosen Toby. Clung to him, and the boy. He had never looked more certain of anything. Later that day, after Max had been returned to his heated kennel to continue his rest, and Toby had eaten a plate of grapes and crackers, Dr. Claire asked if he wanted to draw. Toby nodded. She gave him a fresh stack of paper. New crayons. No prompts. He sat cross-legged again, humming softly to himself. Dr. Claire sat across from him, observing without interference. 15 minutes passed. Toby handed her the page. She took it, expecting another picture of Max. But this was different. This was human. The sketch, crude but unmistakable, showed a man in a heavy coat face partly obscured by shadow. He stood in a snow-laden forest surrounded by tall trees. His posture was tense, spine straight, shoulders hunched forward. In one hand, he held a shovel. In the other, a heavy chain. And lying behind him, half buried in white, was the unmistakable shape of a husky. The man was walking away. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She turned the page slowly, as if afraid it might burn her fingers. "Toby, who is this?" He didn't look up. He picked up another crayon. "The man who left Max," he said. Claire blinked. "Do you know his name?" Toby shook his head. "Not yet, but Max does." Rachel sat nearby, still pale from the earlier events. "You're saying Max showed you this?" Toby's crayon scratched softly. "He doesn't show. I just see it. When I close my eyes. When I sleep." Claire leaned forward. "Toby, can you tell me what happens in your dreams?" The boy paused, then looked up. "It's snowing. A lot. The sky's gray and there's no noise, like the world forgot how to breathe." Claire nodded slowly. "And the man, he says, 'I'm sorry,' but not like he means it. He says it like he has to say it." Toby looked down again, eyes losing focus. Then he digs, not too deep, not too careful. The crayon in his hand trembled. He puts the chain down. On Max. And Max doesn't move. Because he's too tired. Too cold. Claire swallowed hard, and then he walks away. Toby pressed the crayon hard, snapping the tip. He never looks back. The room fell silent. Claire's voice dropped to a whisper. "Toby, have you ever been to a forest like that?" He shook his head. Rachel stood. "This isn't just trauma anymore," she said quietly. "It's memory. But not his." David crossed the room, speaking low. "Claire, you said before there were other kids who experienced things like this." "The boy in Oregon." Claire nodded. "But this is more specific, more immediate." She turned back to Toby. "This man, do you know where he went?" Toby shrugged. "I think he's still hiding." Claire tilted her head. "Hiding from what?" Toby looked up, eyes too serious for his age. "From Max." That evening, the Bennett home was quiet. They'd agreed to let Max stay one more night under observation. But already Toby was asking when he could come home. Not if, when. Rachel tucked him in after dinner, brushing hair from his forehead. "You okay, baby?" Toby nodded, then whispered, "He likes the name Max better." Rachel smiled. "We do too." She leaned down and kissed his forehead. As she turned off the light, Toby spoke again. "Mommy." "Yes, honey. When we find the man." Rachel paused. Toby's voice came out calm, measured. "Do we forgive him?" Rachel turned eyes wide. Toby stared at the ceiling. "Because Max might?" Rachel opened her mouth, closed it, then whispered, "We'll see, sweetheart. We'll see." That night, Rachel and David sat in the living room quiet. The TV was off. The wine was untouched. David broke the silence first. "I feel like we're inside something we don't understand." Rachel nodded. "Like a story that started before we got here." They didn't say anything else. What else was there to say? The next morning, they received another call from Dr. Lim. Max was eating now. Slowly, gently, but eating. He had stood for a few seconds, even wagged his tail. Just once. They told Toby the news and watched his eyes light up. He didn't jump or clap. He simply smiled as if something sacred had been restored, like the sun had finally risen after a night that didn't want to end. Claire came by that afternoon with new information. She'd reviewed local animal shelter records, cross-referenced lost dog reports from the past 5 years, and reached out to a handful of veterinary networks. Nothing matched Max. No microchip, no tags, no registration. He was a ghost. But Toby said something else. I think Max belonged to someone far away. Claire leaned in. Like, another state? Toby frowned. No, like another time. And then he pulled out a new drawing. This one was darker. More trees, more snow, and a house, old, crooked, with a chimney nearly falling in, smoke curling upward, and a window glowing yellow. But the glow felt wrong. Claire studied it carefully. Toby looked at her. That's where he came from. She took the sketch home with her that night, laid it on her desk, and stared at it for hours. Somewhere, somehow, that place existed. She just had to find it. And when she did, she had a feeling the man in Toby's dream would be waiting. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold lingered like something unfinished. It was Sunday morning when Toby spoke of the memory. He had barely touched his cereal, idly stirring the milk until it turned pale gray. Rachel sat across from him, sipping lukewarm coffee, pretending to read the news on her phone. David was outside, clearing the last thin crust of ice off the driveway. Toby looked up. Do you want to know what happened? He asked. Rachel lowered her cup. What happened, baby? Toby paused for a second, as though the words were coming from somewhere else. Not memory, not imagination, something between. Max waited for a long time. He was tired, and the man didn't talk to him anymore. Rachel leaned forward, heart skipping. Toby's voice was quiet, steady. They'd walked far into the trees. The snow was deep, but Max didn't stop. He just kept following. He didn't blink. They stopped at a cabin, but it was old and broken. The roof had holes, and the chimney didn't work. The man didn't go inside. He just looked around, and then took off his gloves. Rachel's breath caught. Toby went on matter-of-fact. There was a shovel in the snow. He didn't bring it. He found it there beside a stack of wood. He looked at Max for a long time. Then he said, Sorry. Rachel stood up. Toby didn't react. He didn't cry when he said it. He just said it like he was throwing the word away. Her hands trembled. Toby, how do you know that? He turned his face to hers. I was there. Silence. Rachel crouched beside him, kneeling. Her voice was low. No, baby, you weren't. You've never been in the forest. You've never even been camping. I know, Toby said. That's why it's strange. David listened to the story later, face drawn. They sat together on the living room couch, Rachel's hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles were white. He described the whole thing, she whispered. The trees, the woodpile, the rusted cabin door. David looked at her. He's never seen a cabin. Rachel shook her head. I've never even shown him a picture of one. Claire arrived 30 minutes later. She didn't sit down. Walk me through everything she said. Rachel repeated it, every word Toby had said. Claire's expression didn't change, but her eyes grew tighter, focused. David interrupted once. Wait, the cabin, he said it had a chimney, right? Rachel nodded. But it didn't work. Crumbling, like stone, blackened inside. Claire pulled out a notebook and wrote quickly. Then she opened her tablet, searching something. Evergreen Forest has multiple zones. Some are protected, some not. There's a ranger station with coordinates of abandoned sites, cabins, hunting blinds, old structures. Rachel frowned. Why does that matter? Claire turned the screen. There was a photograph. Grainy from a drone. A clearing among tall evergreens. At the center, a collapsed wooden cabin with a half-standing chimney. The roof had holes. The wood was blackened. Jesus, David whispered. Toby walked into the room, then clutching a crayon. He glanced at the photo. That's it, he said. Claire stared. You've seen that before. Toby nodded. I see it every night. That afternoon, Claire made a call to the Evergreen Ranger Station. Yes, the voice confirmed. We've got an abandoned hunter's lodge about 12 miles into the unpatrolled zone. Only accessible by foot during this time of year. Last recorded activity was in '07. Can you send coordinates? She asked. The man hesitated. Ma'am, it's not exactly safe. The structure's unstable and there have been snow shifts. We don't recommend civilians go poking around. I'm not a civilian, Claire lied. I'm a forensic psychologist. We may have a lead on an animal cruelty case that traces back there. The line went quiet. Then a long sigh. I'll send you what we have. Rachel and David sat across from Claire again that night. They had waited until Toby had gone to bed. I don't understand, Rachel said. How can he know this? How can he see it? Claire didn't look away. There are two possibilities, she said carefully. The one that keeps me up at night, and the one I can't explain. David folded his arms. Start with the first. Claire leaned forward. There's a theory. Rare fringe. But some researchers, myself included, believe that children are capable of a kind of empathic resonance, particularly with trauma, especially involving living beings in distress. Resonance, Rachel asked. Imagine something is trapped in pain, dying. That kind of energy doesn't just vanish. It echoes. Claire tapped her chest. And certain children somehow can hear that echo. David looked at the stairs where Toby slept. You think he's... What, tuning into the dog's pain? Claire nodded slowly. Maybe more than that. Maybe the pain didn't just call out. Maybe it found him. Rachel sat down hard. And the other possibility, Claire exhaled, that he's remembering something that never belonged to him. A memory passed between species. Not science, not logic, but experience. David shook his head. That's impossible. Claire met his eyes. So is a dog surviving under snow for 3 weeks. Silence. Then Rachel said, You want to take him there, don't you? Claire nodded. Not him. Not yet. But me. I need to see that place. If it's real, if what Toby described is accurate, then we have to consider that what's happening isn't delusion. David looked pale. And if it's not accurate, Claire stood. Then we still have a dog who was chained left to die, and a 4-year-old who found him by dreaming of a place no one else knew existed. The next morning, Claire drove alone into Evergreen. The roads narrowed with every mile. Pines lined the sides like sentries, tall and indifferent. Snow still lingered beneath their boughs, untouched, patient. She parked near the last trailhead and checked the coordinates again. The hike was brutal. Icy underfoot. No clear paths. Twice she nearly slipped into a snowbank, but after nearly 2 hours she found it. The cabin, or what was left. She stood at the edge of the clearing, breath frozen in her lungs. It was exactly as Toby had drawn it. Right down to the crooked chimney. The rusted door half buried. The woodpile toppled beside it. She stepped closer, her boots crunching in silence. Beside the door, something gleamed. A rusted shovel. Claire bent, picked it up. Its handle was splintered, the edge stained. Beside it, an imprint in the snow, old, partially filled. But the shape was unmistakable. Oval, curved, like something had once curled up here and been covered. She didn't move for a long time. The wind stirred through the trees, and Claire felt it not in her ears, but in her bones. A memory that didn't belong to her. A cry, a bark, a whisper of waiting. That night, she returned to the Bennett's home. She showed them the photos. Rachel stared. David couldn't speak. But Toby, he only nodded. That's where it happened, he said. Where he was left. Claire turned to him. Do you remember who left him? Toby shook his head. Not yet. Rachel knelt beside her son, brushing his hair. Do you want to? Toby paused, then answered softly. Yes. And somewhere in the next room, Max lifted his head in his kennel, his ears twitching, as if he'd heard the conversation, as if he was waiting too. It was colder in the forest than it should have been for March. Not the kind of cold that prickled the skin or stung the nose, but a heavier cold. A silence wrapped around silence. The kind that crawled beneath the jacket, slipped under the ribs, and settled just beneath the heart. Claire had driven them as far as the ranger trail would allow. From there, they hiked Rachel, David, Toby, and Max across 2 miles of terrain laced with stubborn snowdrifts and half-frozen soil. Max wore a jacket from the clinic, though he barely seemed to notice the cold. He walked slowly, tired, but with unwavering determination, never straying from Toby's side. The boy didn't complain once. He didn't ask to be carried. He knew where they were going. Claire trailed slightly ahead, GPS in one hand, Toby's most recent drawing in the other. They matched perfectly. The trees, the bend in the ridge, the narrow creek half covered in cracked ice. Landmarks Toby had never seen except in dreams. The forest thinned suddenly. Ahead lay a small clearing framed by birch and pine. At its center, leaning against the slope of the mountain, stood a structure. A hunting cabin, old, crooked, wooden beams blackened with age. A rusted stovepipe jutted from one side, cracked and bent. The door hung open at an angle, swinging slightly with each gust of wind. Toby stopped walking. That's it, he said. Claire looked back. He wasn't afraid. Not visibly. But his hands had gone still, balled into small fists at his sides. Max stopped too, his body tensed, hackles rising. Rachel reached for Toby's hand, but the boy stepped forward on his own. They crossed the clearing in silence. The door creaked as Claire pushed it open. Inside, the smell hit first. Rot. Damp wood. Rusted metal. Something else, something old like regret, soaked into timber. David covered his mouth with his sleeve. Rachel hesitated at the threshold, but Toby stepped past her. He looked around once, then turned to the far wall. There, he said, pointing to a corner of the room. That's where the chain was. A metal ring was bolted into the wall, half rusted through. Beneath it, the floor was stained. David whispered, Jesus Christ. Claire took a photograph. Then Toby turned and walked out the back. There near the firewood stack, a shovel lay discarded. The wood handle splintered. The metal edge chipped. He stood over it for a moment, saying nothing. Max came to stand beside him. Then the dog growled. A low rumbling sound, not from anger, from recognition, from memory. Claire turned sharply. He hears something. From beyond the tree line, a twig snapped, then another, and then emerging from the trees, a man, middle-aged, beard, scraggly eyes sunken, wearing layers of tattered flannel boots caked in mud and an old parka with a missing sleeve. He froze when he saw them. His eyes locked on Max. Max growled louder now, backing slightly but not retreating. The man's face twisted first in disbelief, then terror. No. He stepped forward, then back, then forward again. What the hell is this? He rasped. No. Rachel instinctively stepped in front of Toby. The man pointed a shaking hand at the husky. I buried you. Silence. I buried you 6 feet under. You weren't breathing. You were cold. You were gone. Max didn't move, but his eyes never left the man. The man took a step forward, then stopped, dropping to his knees. I watched you die. His voice cracked. I dug the hole myself. I told myself it was mercy. You were hurt. There was nothing else I could do. You couldn't walk. He looked up, face hollow. But you kept staring at me. You didn't close your eyes. You just looked at me. Like you knew. David stepped forward now. Who are you? The man didn't answer. Claire crouched beside him. You left him here. The man nodded slowly. I was scared. He was all I had left. After the accident. After my wife left. He got hurt on the trail. I couldn't carry him back. I didn't know what to do. The weather was turning. I thought maybe he'd freeze and it would be painless. He looked at Max again, but then he didn't close his eyes. He just kept looking. Rachel spoke quietly. What's his name? The man choked. Max. Toby didn't flinch. I knew that, he said. The man looked at him for the first time, and something shifted in his face. Recognition, not of features, but of presence. You, the man whispered. You weren't there. Toby shook his head. No, but I felt him. I heard him calling. The man's shoulders slumped. I hear him too, he whispered. At night, in the wind, in the trees, every time it snowed. I thought it was guilt. I thought I was going crazy. He stood slowly, hands trembling. Why are you here? Claire answered. Because a 4-year-old boy knew exactly where to find the dog you left to die. The man looked at her. What do you want from me? David stepped forward, voice low. We want to know the truth. The man looked at Max again. I didn't hate him. I loved him. He was mine. Then finally he said it. I'm sorry. He fell to his knees again. I'm sorry, Max. Max took a single step forward, then stopped and sat, watching. The man buried his face in his hands. I thought I'd buried my sin. I thought the snow would keep it. I never imagined it would dig its way out. Toby stepped forward. He stood before the man. Max rose, stood beside him. The boy spoke gently. He didn't come back to punish you. The man looked up. Toby's voice was calm, certain. He just wanted someone to know he was still waiting. Silence fell across the clearing. Then slowly Max walked forward. He approached the man, stopped just within reach. The man reached out hesitantly. Max lowered his head. Their foreheads touched. For a breath, for a heartbeat. Then Max turned, walked back to Toby, and lay down beside him. The message was clear. He had been found, and so had the truth. The forest was quiet again. The kind of quiet that comes after something sacred is unearthed, unspoken, reverent, weighty. The trees stood still, their branches holding the cold like breath in a chest. Max lay beside Toby at the edge of the clearing, the boy's fingers tangled gently in the husky's thick fur. The others watched from a distance, not daring to interrupt whatever bond passed between them. But the man stood alone now, the one who had buried Max. He stared at the cabin's ruined door hands, twitching as if 1,000 memories had burst through that threshold and wrapped their arms around his throat. Rachel approached him first, her voice tentative. You knew him before all this. He didn't answer. Claire took a step forward. Tell us what happened. The man swallowed. His voice was thin, frayed. 6 years ago, maybe 7? Time doesn't work the same when you stop counting it. He looked over at Max. He was a pup when I got him. Ears too big for his head. Used to fall down every 3rd step of the porch and keep trying anyway. Stubborn, loyal. I called him Max because it was short, sharp. Easy to shout from across the woods. David spoke quiet but firm. What changed? The man stared past them, not at them. His eyes distant. Glassy. We used to hunt the ridge near Broken Pine Pass. Late season when most others packed it in. The snow was deep, but still passable if you knew the land. We'd go out for 2-3 days at a time. Max never left my side. He took a slow breath. Then that day, everything went wrong. Claire nodded silently, encouraging him to go on. There was a buck. Big, fresh tracks. Max picked up the scent and bolted down the slope. I followed, not thinking. It was steep. I knew that terrain like the back of my hand, but something was off. The snowpack was wrung too loose under the crust. He closed his eyes. I heard it before I saw it. This deep groan in the earth. Then the crack. Then the whole goddamn world shifted. Rachel covered her mouth. The man's voice grew hoarse. I fell, hit my head. When I came to, Max was under a broken log. He was whining hurt bad. His leg bent wrong, eyes wide scared. He looked down at his shaking hands. I panicked. The wind stirred. I checked for a pulse of breath. Couldn't find either. My head was bleeding. It was getting dark. The storm was coming in. I thought I had to let him go. I didn't want to leave him there for animals, so he broke. His knees buckled, and he hit the frozen ground with a dull thud. His hands covered his face. I dug a hole. With my hands. With a broken branch. I put him in. Covered him. Told him I was sorry. I really thought he was gone. Silence. Max didn't move, but his eyes remained fixed on the man. The man looked up again, tears streaking the grime on his cheeks. I ran back to my truck and never came back. He laughed bitterly. The next day, I checked the news. No avalanche reports, no searches. Nobody ever knew. And I figured maybe I could forget. David shook his head, stunned. You thought you buried a dead dog? But he wasn't dead. The man nodded slowly, sobbing. I hear him in my sleep. All these years, that last look, it never left. The silence under the snow. He turned to Max now, who had risen to his feet. Max stared, not growling, not cowering, just seeing. Then from the silence a voice broke through. Toby. He walked forward, slow, steady. His voice carried soft, but certain. He never blamed you? The man froze. Toby stepped between the trees, and the pain his small body somehow heavier than all of it. You were scared, he said simply. And he forgave you. The man's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Toby stood before him now. Max close behind. And then Toby knelt. So should you. The man dropped his head again and wept. Long, unfiltered sobs tore from him, too much for one breath, too long held in. Rachel covered her face. David looked away, but Max stepped forward. He pressed his head, once left behind, into the man's shaking shoulder, and stayed there, not as a ghost, not as vengeance, but as presence, warm, solid, forgiven. They never meant for it to go public. But things like this don't stay hidden anymore. Not in a world where every neighbor has a phone, every post has a voice, and every miracle becomes a debate. It began with a photo Max curled beside Toby, outside the courthouse, their bodies pressed together like two halves of a story no one could explain. Someone had snapped it and uploaded it with a caption, Boy finds buried dog by Dream. The dog lives. Within 12 hours, it had 3 million views. By the end of the week, the entire town had taken sides. Some called it divine. Fate. A child touched by something greater than reason. Others weren't so kind. He's possessed. Kids don't talk like that unless they've been coached. This whole thing is fake. Talk radio burned with it. Social media frothed. A conservative local paper ran the headline, Malefic Messenger Denver Boy Claims Psychic Bond with Dog Spirit. A week later, a liberal podcast responded, Hope is a 4-year-old boy named Toby. And through it all, the Bennetts stayed quiet. They didn't feed the frenzy. They didn't go on camera. They didn't sign book deals or field interview requests. Rachel deleted her social media. David returned to work. Toby went back to coloring. Max, now healthy enough to run again, stayed by his side day and night. But even silence doesn't stop the tide. Eventually, the state filed charges. The man who had buried Max's name, now revealed as Gerald Harlow, was brought up on felony animal cruelty. The law didn't care about remorse, or forgiveness, or metaphysical explanations. What mattered was that he had left an animal to die in the snow, that he had buried it alive, and now there had to be a reckoning. The courtroom was small, but packed. Press lined the back wall. Protesters clustered outside, some with signs demanding justice for Max, others questioning the entire premise. A man in a preacher's collar muttered Latin under his breath. A woman with blue hair and a dog tattoo held a sign. Some bonds can't be explained, only honored. Inside, Gerald sat slumped between two public defenders. He hadn't shaved, hadn't looked anyone in the eye. Rachel sat in the front row, Toby on her lap. Max lay curled at their feet, calm as stone. Claire was to their right, flanked by veterinary witnesses, animal rights reps, and a wildlife forensic specialist. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The room fell quiet, and the trial began. Prosecutors wasted no time. They painted Gerald as negligent, reckless, emotionally unstable. They called experts who testified that even in trauma, a responsible owner would have called for help. Photos of Max's frostbite, his emaciated frame, the rusted chain found in the cabin, they were all presented. Each one hit like a blow. Rachel couldn't look. Gerald never flinched. Then came the defense. They didn't argue the facts. They admitted to everything. But they argued context. A man alone, injured, isolated, acting under what he believed was mercy. They called Claire to the stand. "What's your professional opinion on Mr. Harlow's decision?" the defense attorney asked. Claire's hands were steady. "I believe he made a catastrophic mistake," she said. "But I also believe he was convinced the animal was dead. And I believe he has suffered ever since." "Do you think he meant harm?" Claire paused. "No, but harm occurred. Yes, that's undeniable." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "Do you believe the boy Toby truly found the dog through dreams?" Objection? Sustained. But the room had already shifted. The tide of the trial wasn't legal anymore. It was spiritual. The judge cleared his throat. "We've heard from witnesses. We've heard expert opinions. But there is one more name on the list." He looked at the defense table. "Toby Bennett." The room turned. Rachel flinched. "I object," she whispered to the bailiff, but the judge was already gesturing. "If the parents agree," he said, "the court will allow a brief statement." David looked at Rachel. Rachel looked at Claire. Claire looked at Toby. Toby stood, walked forward, alone. Max stirred but did not follow. The bailiff lifted him onto the witness chair. He sat small and solemn. The judge leaned forward, softening. "Hi there, Toby." Toby nodded. "Hi. You don't have to say anything you don't want to. But if you'd like, we're all listening." Toby looked over the courtroom. His eyes stopped on Gerald. The man looked down. Couldn't meet the gaze. Toby tilted his head, then said quietly, "He's already said sorry." A few murmurs rippled through the back. The judge raised a hand. Toby's voice didn't rise, but it carried. He didn't bury Max because he was mean. He buried him because he thought Max was gone. The judge blinked. "And what do you think we should do now, Toby?" Toby paused, not like he was thinking, like he was listening. "Then, Max is okay now. But he still has heavy dreams. He still remembers. And that won't stop. Unless someone forgives." He took a breath. "Mr. Gerald needs to be forgiven." The room went still. Even the judge looked moved. "And why's that?" "So Max can sleep." The words hung there, like incense in a cathedral, like the moment before a song ends. Then the silence broke. A woman in the back started crying. Someone exhaled too loudly. Even the bailiff looked down. Gerald's hands were shaking. Toby climbed down from the chair and walked back to his seat. Rachel caught him, cradled him close. Max nuzzled the boy's foot-tail, tapping once against the floor. The judge cleared his throat. "I'll take this under advisement. We'll recess for 30 minutes. In the hallway, Gerald asked to speak. He approached Rachel and David with hands outstretched, palms empty. "I won't make excuses," he said, "and I won't ask anything from you. But I need to say this to him." Rachel hesitated, then nodded. Gerald knelt before Toby. The boy looked at him. "I thought I was doing the only thing I could," Gerald said. "I didn't mean to leave him. But I did." Toby watched him silent. "And I know I can't undo that." He looked down. "But if there's any way I can make it right, I'll try. Every day." Toby reached out, touched Gerald's shoulder. "You don't have to make it right," he said. "Just don't forget." Gerald nodded. "I won't." The court reconvened. The judge returned. "I've reviewed the testimony," he said. "And I believe justice must be served, but not at the cost of compassion." He turned to Gerald. "You will not be incarcerated. Instead, you will be assigned to a long-term program in animal welfare. You will work every day in service of the lives like the one you nearly ended." He banged the gavel once. Sentence delivered. The room didn't cheer, but it breathed again. Outside, the snow had begun to melt for real. Not the forced thaw of early spring, but a gentle one, a natural one. Rachel lifted Toby onto her hip. Max walked beside them. David put a hand on Claire's shoulder. Gerald remained behind at the edge of the courthouse steps. He watched them walk away, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of snow on his shoulders. He felt air, and in the distance, just beneath the wind, a bark, soft, clean, forgiven. It began with silence, not the eerie electric silence of 300 a.m., not the breathless hush before something went wrong, but a softer kind. A kind they hadn't known for months, a kind that settled. For the first time since that terrible, wondrous night, Toby slept through. No barking, no gasping, no whispering in foreign tongues made of wind and instinct, just the stillness of rest. Max lay curled beside the boy's bed, his breathing heavy, and even his flanks rising like ocean waves, caught in slow motion. The husky was older now, still recovering, still slow, but there was strength in his stillness. A kind of calm loyalty that had nothing to do with training, everything to do with memory. Every night, Max would pull himself beside Toby's bed before dusk, even before dinner was done. He no longer followed the family through every room. He no longer watched every movement with wary, haunted eyes. Now he simply lay down where he was needed most. Rachel noticed it first, the absence, the quiet, the peace. She would peek into Toby's room at 3:01, then 3:10, waiting for the noise, for the cycle, for the dark chorus that had once held her boy in its teeth. But it never came, only Toby's soft breathing, and Max's heavier one. In sync, like two clocks resetting together. One morning, Rachel found a drawing left by the breakfast bowl. Not unusual, Toby had returned to coloring every morning, his quiet way of processing the world. But this one was different. It wasn't snow. It wasn't shadows. It wasn't a cabin or a chain or a man with broken eyes. It was a hill, golden, sun-drenched, and Max, running, ears back, tongue lolling, tail up, not hunched or hurt or buried, but alive, fast, joyful. Toby walked into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Rachel turned, holding the picture. "This is beautiful," she said. Toby nodded, climbing into his chair. "I dreamed it." She sat across from him. "Where is it?" He blinked as if the question didn't make sense. "I don't know, but Max does. He said he goes there now when he sleeps." She blinked. "Max told you that?" Toby smiled. "Not with words." Rachel stared at the image again. There was something radiant about it. Not just the yellows and golds, something deeper. A warmth that didn't come from crayons. "He said it's finished," Toby added. "What is?" Toby tilted his head. "The Waiting." Dr. Claire released her paper 2 weeks later. It was published in the Journal of Developmental Empathy and Animal Cognition, a relatively niche journal. But the story exploded far beyond academia. The title was simple: Shared Frequencies, Anomalous Instances of Cross-Species, Emotional Resonance in Post-Traumatic Child Canine Dyads. In it, she detailed the full case. A boy aged 4 began exhibiting dream behaviors, mirroring a dying animal's final moments. A dog buried in snow somehow survived and sought out the child he had never met. The child's drawings, dozens of them, documented a place he had never seen. Events he could not have known and emotional complexities beyond his years. Claire was careful. She didn't make claims about reincarnation mysticism or the supernatural. Instead, she asked a question. What if some children do not merely empathize with pain, but channel it? What if they can serve as emotional receivers, radios for suffering that otherwise has no voice? The article was clinical measured, but it was the postscript that caught fire. If pain echoes, maybe love does too. The press picked it up within days. Claire was invited to speak at universities. TEDx reached out. She declined most interviews, except one, an audio-only podcast for a grief counseling network. In that quiet, tear-lined conversation, she said something that would become a quote passed around online for years. Some bonds defy explanation because they predate words. They belong to the space between heartbeat and silence. Max's story became a symbol, not of magic, not of mystery, but of endurance. Schools invited Claire to talk about empathy. Therapists cited the study and research on trauma. And Toby, unaware of the noise outside their quiet little house, just kept being Toby. He played with Max. He fed him each morning. He read him stories, even though Max had never shown interest in books. He always laid down when Toby opened one. They went on walks through the park. Max never left his side. Not once. At the playground, parents still stared. Some whispered, "That's the boy with the dream dog." But Toby never noticed. Or if he did, he didn't care. He was too busy helping Max up the slide. One night, close to midnight, Claire visited again. She'd just flown back from a lecture in Austin, her voice still hoarse from the Q&A. David opened the door, gesturing toward the living room. "I didn't want to call," he said. "It's not an emergency. Just..." Toby said something. Claire stepped inside, setting down her coat. "Go on." Rachel was on the couch, Max sleeping at her feet. Toby was curled beside him, blanket wrapped around both of them. David whispered. He said it again. Claire lowered her voice. "Said what?" "That Max goes somewhere." Claire crouched, brushing hair from Toby's forehead. "Did he describe it again?" Rachel nodded. "Said it was like the sun comes from the ground instead of the sky. That Max doesn't limp there. And there are other dogs, just light and running and no end." Claire sat quietly, eyes glossy. "I think that's the only heaven worth believing in," she whispered. David leaned against the wall. "Do you think this will fade?" "The bond." Claire looked at Max, then Toby. "I don't know. But maybe it's not about fading. Maybe it's about carrying." She looked down at the boy. Maybe some people are just meant to carry certain hearts for a while. Spring came early that year. By May, the snow was a memory. Max grew slower. His eyes fogged slightly. He no longer chased squirrels or barked at delivery trucks, but he never stopped waiting for bedtime. Each night, Toby would lie on the rug and Max would curl beside him, nose to his chest. And each night, just before sleep, Toby would whisper something no one else heard, then smile and drift off. Then one evening, Toby came downstairs holding a final drawing. He placed it on the table beside dinner. It was Max, just Max, standing on the hill again. But this time he looked back. Not running, not playing, just standing, looking behind him, waiting. Beneath the picture in Toby's uneven handwriting were 4 words. "He'll run ahead now." Rachel read it, tears rising. Toby sat beside her. He said, "It's almost time." David swallowed hard. "Time for what, bud?" Toby didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night, Max slept beside Toby one last time. In the morning, he didn't rise. He was still, peaceful, whole. They buried him on a ridge behind the house beneath the birch trees. Toby chose the spot. Rachel picked the stone. Claire wrote the inscription. He waited in the snow, and he ran in the sun. Now he rests. The day after, Toby sat in the grass near the grave. Claire knelt beside him. "You okay?" she asked. Toby nodded. "He's there." "Not here," he said. She followed his gaze toward the trees. "Where?" Toby looked up at her. "Anywhere I need him to be." The forest had changed. The snow was gone now, replaced by soft moss and damp soil. Spring light filtered through budding branches, dappling the path in gold and green. Birds called from above, cautious and hopeful. Somewhere in the distance, a creek murmured like a lullaby, too old for language. They had waited for this day, not rushed it, not forced it, but somehow they had all known it was coming. Toby sat in the back seat, his hand resting on Max's side as the car wound through the familiar trailheads and unpaved curves leading to Evergreen. He hadn't spoken much since morning, just quietly prepared. He had brushed Max's coat himself, gently, reverently, as if the act meant more than just grooming. As if he were preparing a soldier for his last walk. Rachel sat beside him, hands tight in her lap. David drove, his jaw clenched, but his eyes clear. Claire followed in her own car, giving them space, bearing witness. Max's head lay heavy on Toby's thigh. His breathing was slower now, softer. Each inhale a little thinner than the last. But his eyes were open barely, and when the wind carried pine through the cracked window, his nose twitched. He remembered this place. Toby leaned down, pressed his forehead to the dog's ear. "We're going back." Max didn't move, but he didn't need to. He already knew. They parked near the same trailhead they had once taken months ago now, though it felt like a lifetime. Toby led the way. David offered to carry Max, but Toby shook his head. He wants to walk as far as he can. Max stumbled at first. His back legs lagged behind. But then, like muscle remembered what mind had forgotten, he pushed forward. Slow, yes, but purposeful. No leash, no harness. Just him and the boy. They passed the ridge, where Gerald had once broken. Past the clearing where silence had bloomed like frost. And then beyond it, they reached a place none of them had seen before, but all of them recognized. The hill from Toby's drawings. It wasn't large, barely a rise in the land. But the way the sunlight fell upon it, low and amber, warm and endless, it looked like something out of another world. Toby stepped into the clearing. Max followed one step behind. Rachel couldn't move. Claire placed a hand on her arm. "Let them go." David swallowed hard. They watched as Toby walked up the hill. Near the crest, he stopped. Max stopped too. The boy turned, looked back at his parents, then knelt. He pulled something from his pocket. A small worn collar, not Max's current one, the clean nylon one from the clinic. This was older, leather, frayed, still crusted faintly with dirt from a past that refused to stay buried. Gerald had mailed it weeks ago. A note had come with it. "This belongs with him if he wants it. I kept it because I didn't know how to let go." Toby held it up now. Max sniffed it, then gently placed one paw over it. "Claimed it." Toby smiled, then stood. "Okay," he said. Rachel's heart cracked. Just the word, just that sound. Max took a few steps forward. 1, 2, 3. Then he stopped, turned, and walked back to Toby. The boy dropped to the ground. Max curled beside him, nose in his lap. The sun dropped lower. David wiped his face, fighting the trembling in his chest. Rachel reached for his hand and didn't let go. Claire stood behind them, still and quiet. Then, in the distance, the breeze rose. It moved gently over the trees, through the leaves, across the grass. And Toby spoke. He said, "This is the spot." Rachel blinked. "The spot for what, baby?" Toby looked down at Max. For his last dream. No one spoke, not even the forest. Max let out a long sigh, then another. Then nothing, not silence, but stillness, a stillness too perfect to be empty. Toby didn't cry. He placed his hand on Max's head and stayed like that. For minutes, maybe hours. Time bent around them. The sun sank lower, pouring light across the hilltop like a blessing. Eventually, Toby stood. He looked down at Max, then at the sky. He whispered something no one could hear, and the wind carried it anyway. Rachel started forward, but Claire held her back. "Let him finish," she whispered. Toby turned and walked toward them. Each step was deliberate, like the end of a ritual. He reached Rachel and David and took both their hands. Then he looked up at them, face calm. "He's free now." Rachel knelt weeping and held him close. They stood together like that until the sun slipped beneath the horizon and dusk wrapped around them. They buried Max right there. Toby marked the spot with stones. He didn't want a gravestone, didn't want marble or a plaque, just the collar, laid gently in the earth, and a promise that they would come back, not to mourn, but to sit, to be still, to listen, because sometimes, if the wind is just right, you can still hear paws in the grass, still hear joy in the breeze, still hear a name whispered by leaves, and when you do, you know he's still running, just ahead, waiting. The dirt was softer this time, not frozen like before, not laced with panic or guilt, just damp with spring and honest with memory. Toby dug the hole himself. He used his small hands, slow, careful, the way a child might plant a seed, knowing it would grow but never expecting it to be quick. David had offered to help, Rachel too. But Toby had simply said, "No, this one's mine." And so they stood back, watched him work in the quiet afternoon. The light was gold, the air cool, the forest whispering like an old friend. The spot was the same, exactly the same. The one Max had once been buried in. The place where snow and chain and breathless waiting had once held him captive. But now it held something else, a kind of grace. Toby didn't cry as he placed Max's body into the earth. The dog was wrapped in a wool blanket worn and loved one Toby had slept with every night for months. On top of Max's chest, Toby placed the old leather collar, the one from before, and something else, a crayon drawing, folded carefully, the one with the sunlit hill and Max running free. He tucked it gently beside Max's front paw. "I made this so you won't forget the way." Rachel looked away, her hand clutching David's. Claire stood further back alone, tears in her eyes, but not on her cheeks. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood still, breathing, witnessing. Toby filled the grave slowly, one scoop at a time. No rush. He was burying more than a body. He was sealing a story. When the final handful of earth had been placed, Toby sat down beside the mound and placed his palm over it. He closed his eyes, and for a long moment there was nothing. No wind, no birds, only presence. And then softly Toby whispered, "You're not trapped anymore." That night the house was quiet. No reporters, no phone calls, no messages from strangers trying to make sense of the unspeakable. Just home. Rachel tucked Toby in, brushed the hair from his forehead, kissed his cheek. "Good night, baby." He blinked up at her, "Mom." She smiled. "Yeah, I think I'll sleep good tonight." She nodded, throat tight. "I think you will too." He rolled over, pulled the blanket up to his chin. Within minutes he was gone. Not the twitching half-sleep of before. Not the tight-fisted dreaming of nightmares and barking and words that didn't belong to him. This was real sleep. Clean, deep, healing. And as his body relaxed, something inside him lifted. In the dream, he was standing in a field. He didn't recognize it at first, but his feet knew the dirt. His nose caught scents that made no sense, but felt like home. Grass, wind, rabbit, sunlight, and joy. He looked down and saw paws. Not hands. White, steady, strong. He took a step. Felt his body respond, not like a boy's, but like something made for motion. Muscle and memory. Breath and instinct. He barked once. The sound was perfect. And then from over the hill, Max appeared. Running. Young. Unbroken. They met in the center of the field. No words. Just one circle around each other. One shared lick. One heartbeat. And then they ran. Together. Faster than wind. Faster than light. Across the hills. Over the golden grass. Through air that tasted like laughter and light. And in that dream, they were not two creatures. Not boy and dog. Not past and present. They were one. One spirit in two bodies. One bond that never cracked under time or death or doubt. They ran until the sky turned lavender. Until the stars blinked open like eyes of old friends. And then as they reached the ridge, Max slowed. Stopped. Toby turned. Max looked at him. His eyes weren't sad. Just sure. They walked together to the edge. And Max laid down. Toby sat beside him. They watched the horizon in silence. And then Max nudged him once with his nose. A goodbye. But not a departure. A passing of the torch. Toby whispered, "I'll find you again." Max blinked once. The stars shimmered. And the field faded. Morning light warmed the edges of Toby's blanket. He stretched. Sat up. Rachel stood in the doorway. "Good morning, sleepyhead." He blinked. Smiled. "I ran." She laughed softly. "You dreamed again." He nodded. With Max. David walked in, a plate of toast in hand. Toby took a bite, chewed, then said, "We didn't say goodbye. We said, see you next time." David knelt. "I believe it." Toby looked up at them both. "He's okay now. Really okay." Rachel kissed his forehead and whispered, "So are you." Later that day, they went to the ridge, brought a blanket, a book, a small wind chime Toby had made out of sticks and string. They hung it in the birch tree beside Max's grave. When the wind blew, it didn't make music exactly, but it moved, it danced. And in the soft air that passed across their shoulders, they felt something that didn't need words, didn't need proof. They just knew. He was still running, and he always would be. Time passed in the quiet way it often does after something profound, without permission, but with purpose. The seasons folded over themselves like soft linens, and with each new sunrise, Toby grew. He laughed louder now, ran faster, asked different kinds of questions, some about the stars, some about why people say things they don't mean, some about dogs and dreams and whether love ever runs out. Rachel always answered gently, even when the answers scared her. David built a new garden bed in the backyard. It sat close to the birch tree where Max was buried beneath the chime Toby had made. They planted wildflowers, coreopsis forget-me-nots, milkweed, and they came back stronger every spring. Max's name wasn't carved into a stone. That had been Toby's choice. "He's not there," he'd said. "He's around." But in the living room, just above the mantel, hung the final drawing. Max free hole running across an endless blue sky. The hill beneath him glowed like gold, lit from inside. There were no chains, no shadows, no snow. Just wind, just joy. Toby had drawn it after his last dream. "I don't think he comes to visit anymore," he'd said one morning, pouring milk into his cereal. "Not because he left. Because I don't need to find him anymore." Rachel had smiled, fighting tears. "You'll always have him." "I know," Toby had replied. "He's not gone, just farther ahead." That was how it settled between them. Not as an ending, but as a knowing. Claire still visited, though less frequently now. Her study had gained traction, her work cited in research across animal therapy, childhood trauma, and even quantum psychology. But she never presented Toby as a case. She never used his name. He wasn't a phenomenon. He was a boy who loved a dog, and who listened to the quiet things most people ignore. They sat on the back porch, sometimes Claire and Toby, sipping lemonade and watching the wind move the trees. She would ask if he'd had any new dreams. He always said no. But sometimes he'd smile like he was holding something back. He never said goodbye to her when she left. Just next time. Years passed. The drawing stayed on the wall. Its paper faded slightly, but the colors never dulled. Rachel dusted the frame every week, careful not to smudge the glass. David would look at it sometimes, when no one was watching, his fingers curling around the edge of the mantel, like it was the edge of a memory he didn't want to fall into. Toby, now taller, still looked at it too. But never for long. He didn't need to. He carried it inside him. One spring evening, long after the snow had stopped surprising anyone, Toby stepped outside alone. The sky was a wash of soft colors. Apricot, dusty rose, faint periwinkle where the moon waited to rise. The air held a hush. He stood in the yard, barefoot toes pressed into the warm dirt. Around him the garden whispered in the soft breeze. The wildflowers leaned together like old friends. He looked up. The stars hadn't arrived yet, but he knew where they'd be. Toby closed his eyes, listened. Wind brushed his cheek. Carried scents of soil tree bark, rain that hadn't fallen yet. And then, from far off, from nowhere and everywhere, a bark, soft, small, but warm. It didn't echo. It didn't linger. It just existed for one perfect second. Toby opened his eyes. He didn't turn around, didn't speak. He just smiled. Not the smile of surprise. The smile of someone who was expected. And then slowly he nodded. Somewhere in the trees, the wind turned and carried on. Inside the house, Rachel looked out the window and saw him standing there. David joined her. "He's hearing it again," she whispered. David nodded, and neither of them moved. They didn't need to. The camera pulls back. Toby, alone in the yard, head tilted slightly toward the horizon. The wind lifts his hair. The wildflowers sway. And somewhere in a space between time and memory, the shape of a husky runs along a sunlit ridge. Not as a ghost, not as a symbol, just as himself. Free. And then darkness softens across the screen, and the final line appears. Sometimes love doesn't need words. It only needs a dream and a bark in the night.